So you're all very, very welcome to this DSA hosted event on Fcdo and the future of UK aid. This is hosted by the Development Studies Association, which is the learning society for development studies, and it's the membership organisation for all those studying, researching and teaching within global development in the UK. As many of you know, being members or otherwise friends of us. So we felt it was really important to keep the debate going about the future of UK aid, not just because of the big shifts that were introduced last year, but also because of the pandemic, of course, and also the wider geopolitical and ideological climate within which we find ourselves. With the reality of Brexit now upon us, and with open questions around what the US presidency might or might not mean for the future of international cooperation. However, superb panel to help us talk through some of these challenges. And I'll introduce them shortly. You'll notice that we're not fully politically balanced from a partisan point of view. That wasn't for the want of trying. We did try to, we asked several representatives of the Conservative Party. Unfortunately, no one was able to attend. But we are keen on a very robust and open debate, including around some things which you might take for granted or assume that everyone agrees on. So when it comes to questions from the floor, we will privilege challengers. We will encourage our panelists to challenge each other on points of view. So onto our panel. We have 4 panelists, but only room for 4 of us on here, so we'll be shuffling on and off. Firstly, you can see Preet Gill, Labour MP for Birmingham Edgbaston since 2017, and the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development since April 2020, but involved in that brief for nearly 3 years now. We have Melissa Leach, Professor of Development Studies and Director of the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex. And Melissa also plays a leading role, advisory role in many of the processes associated with international development research, including being an independent member of the Strategic Coherence of ODA-funded Research Board. We have Ranil Dissanayake, Policy Fellow at the Centre for Global Development. And he's been a senior economic advisor to successive chief economists at DFID, as was between 2016 and 2020. And many of the people will feel your pain. Ranil, you're also doing a PhD at Vatnik, I think, at the moment at the University of Oxford. So good luck with that. And our final panelist, if James, you could shuffle our deck, is Stephanie Draper, who is the Chief Executive of BOND, the UK network of organisations working in international development. And Stephanie's worked for over 20 years on sustainable development, having previously worked at the Forum for the Future on how to achieve systems change to meet the sustainable, the UN global goals. In the background, when you want to ask questions, we have Annalisa Prison, who's my co-chair. She's a DSA council member and a senior research fellow at and so when you want to ask a question, then you should use the raised hand function. That will enable you to pose a question. And Annalisa will sort through those. And you can either ask the question from the floor, or we could bring you to the podium later on. The text chat is really just for technical issues, and James, our admin, will be responding to that. So stick to raised hands for questions, please. A warning that we are recording this session, so we can preserve it for a broader audience. So you might want to bear that in mind before leaping to the podium or posing your question. And the last point from me before we go to our panel is the format, which is question time style. So we will have 3 topics. The first of which is on aid expenditure and the shift from 0.7 to 0.5 and other issues. The second is on the merger, where that's going, what it means. And the final one, obviously, given the audience we have, is on development research and what this means for development research. So each panelist will comment on each of them before then, for about 3 or 4 minutes each, before we then go to yourselves as audience members to raise your questions and contribute. So hopefully that's clear enough for now. And let's get going with the first part of that on the topic of UK aid. So we know from the announcement on the 25th of November that this government wants to reduce spending from 0.7 to 0.5 at GNI. There's mixed messages here. Apparently, the Foreign Secretary intends to move back to 0.7 when public finances allow, but at the same time, there's a plan to bring in legislation, which implies something a bit more solid than that. This raises important issues around the morality of making such a move at this time, given the pandemic. And we also have a number of other issues which might tell us a bit about where this new reduced aid portfolio might be going in terms of the 7 global challenges, which Dominic Raab has presented to Parliament via the International Development's Parliamentary Committee, and as some signals on where this should be spent in countries that are aligned with the UK interests. So on such a political question, there's an obvious person to start with here. So Preet, can you give us your view on this, where Labour stands on this in the first instance, and where we should be moving when we're talking about the overall level and direction of UK aid?
No, thank you so much, Sam, and it's a real honour to be here with you all. And as you know, the announcement made during the spending review around the cuts for the aid budget didn't actually need to happen, because this is pretty much a political choice, because we all know as GDP drops, then the aid budget would naturally have fallen. So there was no need for the government to even make an announcement that they wanted to bring forward legislation. I think many of us were really curious as to what that meant, and actually whether during this government's time, given the pressures on the public purse, that we were actually this was going to be really pretty much the start of the attack on the aid budget. What's been really encouraging, though, is we've seen the support from across the House, cross party, and I think something that the government probably just did not envisage, that there was going to be such strong level of feeling and support. And of course, he's been criticised for reneging on a manifesto commitment that he made and his party supported. And so this is absolutely devastating to see these sort of announcements, especially, as you said, in the midst of a global pandemic. But the Prime Minister has continued to say that he wanted to end an era of British retreat from the world stage, where actually what we've seen from this Prime Minister during this pandemic is pretty much that. They have pretty much retreated from the world stage, leaving the onus to multilateral systems, because of course they've been involved in a takeover of a world-leading department like DFID. And I think the cuts really do just show that he is not showing leadership. This is absolutely retreating. This is not the thing that the British public or any of us in the development sector actually want to see. And rather than focusing on tackling the global pandemic, reducing the number of direct deaths it could cause, as well as the direct economic and social implications, the government just pretty much has ordered a very costly Whitehall restructure. And that's pretty much to try and distract the public from their mishandling of the virus. And that in itself is really, really disappointing. And then, of course, we all saw them take this very opaque prioritization process about cutting life-saving and life-changing projects and programs, which, despite me asking the Secretary of State, whether that's through parliamentary questions, letters, freedom of information requests now, he has still refused to disclose the details of what's actually being cut. And that's really concerning, because this government feels it can pretty much drip feed us with what's being cut at different intervals, as opposed to really being open to scrutiny and accountability, and letting us assess and analyse what programmes were being cut and what was going to be the likely impact of that. Before they went out to the sector and sort of start thinking about projects in Ukraine and other areas that clearly is a priority for them. So, I think we can expect more in terms of cuts. I don't think we should rest on our laurels. I think there is a lot of work we need to do. We could, really put the pressure on this government. But I think what really has poured salt in the wound for me, though, is this failure to include tackling poverty, an area I would say that the UK pretty much has developed a leading role in, which has improved people's lives. It's enhanced enhanced our soft power, and it's been a priority for UK aid in recent years. And of course, the Labour Party wants to go much further than just poverty reduction. It is about addressing inequalities as well. And, under this government, we've seen the diversion of the aid budget away from the poorest countries to projects and programmes that really pretty much have stretched that definition of what constitutes humanitarian or development support to breaking point. So it's an active choice, I have to say, that successive secretaries of state have made, and it really has got to stop. The Labour Party, though, we're very clear that 0.7% target has got to be protected. It's not only the right thing to do, but it's also a signal to the rest of the world about our values, who we are, what it says about us, and that actually aid should be spent on eradicating poverty and tackling the inequalities. And these inequalities are going to be much more exacerbated post-COVID, and part of our recovery. And I a lot of the work that we've been doing is really trying to work with members in both the Commons and the Lords from all political persuasions to fight any legislative changes, not only to the 0.7, but also, I guess, to the threat to the 2002 Development Act, because I think this is a real concern. We've heard Rob talk about that as well. And I don't think, any of us think that this is going to be the end of the government's vandalism of development. They have done this really because they don't fear the consequences, and we have got to absolutely have a joined up approach. We've all got to speak up. I know it's been very difficult sometimes for various in the sector, whether they're small charities, because the relationship with DFID over the years has become quite bureaucratic and quite codependent. And I think we've got to be able to use our platforms, our voices, to really speak out on behalf of the world's poorest. And there's been some really good polling suggesting that the British public are really behind us, especially when we think about the equitable access to the vaccine, making sure that the world's poorest, and it's not just the wealthiest nations at the front of the line, taking that up, but actually, we need to see more countries, put money into the COVAX facility. Yes, there's been $1 billion now, but of course, we've seen many nations that hadn't contributed. I also think there's going to be lots of pressure on this government now that we have a Biden administration who will reset, global leadership back on the stage, who will recommit to climate and development priorities. And I think that's really going to push the UK government into really thinking through its priorities on development and making sure that, it has poverty as a focus. So for us, we have a huge challenge in terms of really holding this government to account, especially when they're refusing this, especially when they're not sharing the information and trying to get any detail out of them. And of course, the integrated review the can's been kicked down, but a lot of decisions have pretty much been taken outside of that review. What's really sad though is that this government doesn't actually know how this department, the new department, is actually going to work. And we're right in the midst of global pandemic. We shouldn't be taking our eye off secondary impacts and working with the WHO, leading the efforts around access to treatments and other technologies. Thanks, Sam. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Preet. Stephanie, can I come to you on some of the issues that were raised there, particularly in terms of the impacts of reduced aid? But Preet also raised questions about the nature of public support for UK aid and how the relationship potentially between NGOs and the government has maybe not helped build a broader constituency. But if you could speak to the first issue and then the second one, perhaps.
Yeah, I obviously we think that the proposed cuts are a critical mistake, and we think that there's a good chance that they will not get through Parliament because there is such a high level of opposition. We also think that there's a risk that because of that opposition, they'll just do them anyway and retrospectively make a claim that we couldn't meet the 0.7 target. So that the impact of that is threefold. The first and the most important is about what the impact is on marginalised communities and vulnerable people throughout the world. Now, if you kind of look at this as a 30% cut and you look at what DFID achieved in a certain period, so between 2015 and 2018, DFID immunised 74 million children, saving 1.4 million lives. If you kind of aggregate that up and look at that as a 30% cut, you have 5.6 million children not being vaccinated. over 100,000 lives not saved. So that's the kind of, and you can do that again for water and sanitation, for education, for maternal health work. So these impacts are real. They really affect human beings on the ground. And clearly the way that those cuts work is not going to be a 30% cut across the piece. It's going to be, right, we're going to stop doing certain areas of work. And that is what's really unclear. And that is sort of frustrating about the last set of cuts and not really knowing how those have fallen, and so not seeing what will happen next. But there's also this other side of which also referred to, and I think we're probably in a lot of agreement around the UK's standing in the world. The 0.7 it says a lot about what we are, who we are as a neighbour, as a country that plays our part, and the British Council have done lots of research around playing our part being a really important part of our soft power. I'm not sort of massively keen on the term soft power, because I think actually what we should be moving towards is more understanding of our interdependencies and how we should all be partnering and supporting each other on a much more kind of level platform. But that's the reality. And in the year where we're hosting the G7, or the D10, as people like to call it, now that we're inviting India and South Korea and Australia as well, and also COP26, we need to be in a position where we can stand behind our commitments and encourage others to do similar, and we're undermining that. And as we said, I mean, Biden officials have referred to the cut as extremely unfortunate, which I think is a serious understatement when it comes to thinking about people who need this sort of support. And then finally, I think it's that whole thing of it makes the world less safe and healthy and sustainable, which when we have major global challenges like climate change and a global pandemic, it's not a moment to be retracting from the global stage and from the commitments needed. And if you sort of look at how that works as a system, so we're stepping forward with 24 billion of investment in defence, and at the same time cutting the aid budget. Not saying that that isn't an important investment to make, but the two work hand in hand. And actually, it is way more cost effective to work on peace building or conflict prevention than even humanitarian response, let alone the kind of big kit that you need in order to exert hard power. So it is, I think, a real tragedy, and it's something that we're really good at, and we're still hopeful that it won't happen. And if it does, then that commitment to spending the aid budget on poverty alleviation and sustainable development is really key.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephanie. We'll come back to you with a question in a second. One for the audience. I think I gave you the wrong instruction. If you want to ask a question, you need to use funnily enough, the Ask Question button. I can't see that from my admin role, but use that, not raise hands. So Ask Questions is where you need to go. In terms of where the aid cuts have come, I think around 89% of it has been with the multilateral support for multilateral institutions. So I want to ask Melissa shortly to reflect on that, both, I guess, in terms of global Britain, but also in the context of global health in particular. Firstly, Ranil, can you comment on this debate about whether we should have 0.7 as the goal? There's been a lot of debate around whether it makes sense to have a target full stop in relation to overseas aid. And additional to that, Simon Maxwell has posed a question, is that cuts are coming, whichever way you look at it, even with a target. Where would be the place to start making cuts? So over to you.
Yeah, so 0.7 was always an arbitrary target. And I mean, it was a good target. It was good to spend more on aid. I mean, it could have been 1%, 1.5%, and that still would have been obviously a good thing for the world. But it's also not right to, one of the unfortunate things about 0.7 was that it focused us very, very much on how much we were spending on this this number of how much aid there is, rather than the what, the how, and the where, which is frankly a lot more important. It is not the case that you could look at the current aid budget and say that there is everything is equally valuable. So I think that it's quite easy to look at the aid budget and identify things that should be cut right down to the bone, like the Prosperity Fund, which had not been particularly effective, aimed at richer countries, and it often has poverty as a sort of secondary part of the target. Much of the Home Office's spend on using ODA is, I mean, frankly, quite possibly making the world worse off rather than better. And that could be cut right down to the bone. There should be substantial cuts to the CSSF, which in the sort of spending review had about £800 million allocated to it. I have no idea whether those cuts to that will come in, but in the context of substantial reduction to the aid budget, you would expect that should go down. And also there are large funds that are run by BEIS, that, like the Newton Fund, which is a research fund. It used to be non-ODA, and now it's been reclassified as ODA. It, again, focuses primarily on richer countries, and it may be very, very valuable research, but there's no reason it has to be ODA. So I think really there are two battles going on here. One is about what it says about us as a country if we cut aid during a sort of particularly difficult time, and also whether it actually gives us any serious benefit. It's akin to trying to pay off your mortgage faster by switching to a cheaper brand of cereal. It is fiddling at the margin against an absolutely massive national debt. It makes no difference. So we don't have to do it. But I think there's a danger in focusing just on that, because the decision-making process that determines where ODA money gets spent has not been great in the last few years, and it could be much, much better. And I think taking advantage of any cuts that do occur to ruthlessly focus ODA on the places where it can do the most good, on the things that it does well, is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Rana. We'll come to that in the second topic as well, as to really how possible that is in a merged ministry context. But firstly, Melissa, a couple of issues there raised around what the cut to UK aid mean for our role in multilateral cooperation, maybe around health, but also your broader perspective on aid spend.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to say, first of all, I really agree with the points that Preet and Steph in particular have made about the devastating consequences of these cuts, if they happen, for both millions of the world's poorest people and for the UK's international reputation. But I think the crucial thing also is the poor timing of this, and the fact that I think we don't yet know what proportion of the cuts may fall on multilateral cooperation, but it's pretty bad timing if it does, given that COVID-19 coming on top of and related to other crises like climate change have underlined how completely interdependent and interconnected our world is, and how critical it is to invest in tackling these global challenges that affect us all. So yes, that's health. Yes, it's climate change, but actually it's also poverty and inequalities, and the investments made in tackling poverty, inequalities, conflict in countries around the world are also going to have interconnected benefits for all of us. They'll keep all of us safer. So I think the interconnection argument is really important, and that can be achieved through support to multilateral institutions. And I think the World Health Organization, of course, is absolutely uppermost in everyone's minds at the moment. And for all that one can make arguments about reforms that are needed, could the WHO be swifter, more quick to react, more community-based in its approaches. These are arguments many of us are making. There's room for reform, but nevertheless, UN agencies such as the WHO are vital. They're the nearest we have to global governance, and these are global challenges which absolutely need global cooperation. So we mustn't pull back from those. The other point I just wanted to make is that I think the UK public get this across the political spectrum. And I think we've just heard today, I mean, this was alluded to by Preet and Steph, but actually just published today are the latest statistics of the polling that the Coalition for Global Prosperity has published, which focused explicitly not on voters in the southeast who might be expected to think that way, but on the red wall constituencies, people who voted Conservative in the last election, but for a different party earlier, those new converts. And what do we find? We find that more than a third support the UK helping others overseas. Just over a third oppose, and just under a third are undecided. But if you drill down a bit further, you find that 80% of voters who switched to the Conservatives in 2019 actually support this statement that Britain should be a force for good in the world, and that helping the poorest is the right thing to do. And 95% of voters, and bear in mind who these voters are, said it was important for Britain to support developing countries to prevent and contain future pandemic diseases like COVID. In other words, the public across the spectrum really get this interconnection point. And this is a strong one that ought to be made. I think the other point is that COVID, in terms of timing, COVID has absolutely focused attention not just on interconnections, but also on the possibility and the need for really transformative kinds of development that steer the world on better paths. COVID's laid bare deep inequalities. It's intensified poverty. It's shown the problems also related to environment and climate. And I think it's shown us that post-pandemic, if and when we get to that point, aid is more vital than ever, although it also underlines some ways in which it can and should be done differently. And finally, just picking up on a point we'll take later, I think, about research, is that we need to recognise that any cuts to the UK's already quite modest ODA research budget is actually going significantly to damage the effectiveness of aid programmes. And I think I might take issue with some of the points that Ranil's just made. Maybe we can bring that up around research, around whether the research budget is an easy target for cuts. I believe it's a very poor target for cuts and would be very damaging.
Okay, well, let's come back to that shortly. Thanks for raising that. Steph, I want to come back to you on a couple of things Melissa raised there. In some of the coverage of the popular support for aid in the country that Melissa's just referred to, there's been some criticism of the NGO sector for being a bit too close to government and not really willing to challenge it, and perhaps for not having developed its constituency in potentially red wall areas. Some work by colleagues Nikki Banks and Dan Brockington have proved that there's quite a concentration of money to NGOs around the south and southeast. How is Bond working through this issue of becoming part of a broader based movement, I guess, for thinking about aid, not necessarily aid levels, but aid in a more general sense of popular support?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a mixed picture in terms of popular support, and I think today's survey from CPD was encouraging. The reality is that NGOs have been focused on getting the work done and on the issues and the matter in hand, and I think sometimes that is about really proactively engaging with government. It's always more positive to work in partnership if you can, and at times being sort of critical and holding government to account. And I think that is always a line that NGOs are having to walk, being that sort of critical friend, but having enough traction and engagement to be able to do that in a constructive way. I think we are conscious that that public support needs to be much more actively demonstrated to politicians, because there is this kind of sense that that people are not as concerned about Britain's role in the world. And we, from sort of informal conversations, don't think that that is the case. It's just how it's counts. So I think one of the things that perhaps our members haven't invested so much in is kind of that mobilization and that kind of constant engagement with the public. And we're also conscious that things like fundraising, sometimes we're reinforcing the problem by saying people are still starving, and that's not a very sort of positive, empowering message that says that aid is really working. So a lot of people are really working hard to turn the tide on that. And we have to be showing that we really are making progress and working in partnership and having people on the ground able to tell their own stories of success to build that support.
Thanks for that. Melissa, Preet and Stephanie have all very much focused on the importance of poverty reduction for UK aid, and that was obviously inscribed in the 2002 legislation. Randall, you've also been writing about other issues around where aid should go in and how it could be usefully targeted towards some middle income countries, or what aid should look like in mix. And there is a constituency within development studies that think that we ran away too quickly from countries that moved quite quickly recently into middle income status, and thereby we've lost a clearer sense of how countries develop and structurally transform and deal with later development questions. Could you speak to that issue as well, please, before we'll move on to the second topic?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing is that most aid should be aimed at poorer countries, not at mix. You would have to expect that aid be used much, much more effectively in middle-income countries than in low-income countries to have any sort of rational sort of utility-based argument for focusing more over on middle-income countries. The poorest people are in low-income countries. There are many, many poor people in middle-income countries as well, but sort of not worrying so much about the distinction between low-income and lower middle-income, for example, but just thinking about, to say, the poorest 50 countries in the world, you could happily spend the entire global ODA budget in those countries and do much more good than you could if you were starting to spend money in places like India, where aid is a fraction of the domestic revenues available. So the purpose of our work on spending in middle-income countries was not so much to make the case for spending more in middle-income countries, but to spend differently in middle-income countries. What you do in middle-income countries should not look like what we do in low-income countries. It shouldn't be large grant-based, large programs of grants where sort of hundreds of millions or tens of millions of pounds. They should be very small, very focused on fixing a specific constraint, a specific problem that can leverage in sort of larger action by other actors that can do more. And it's really, particularly in middle-income countries, ODA should always be focused on sort of bringing forward state capacity rather than replacing it. In very, very poor countries, there may be many things, many basic services that you just need to work with the government and work with local actors to just deliver directly. That's not really the case in most middle-income countries. In most middle-income countries, we should be working in a very, very different way. And actually sort of so looking forward to the next sort of area of questions a little bit, that's one area where the sort of merger of DFID and the Fcdo may actually prove to be helpful, in the sense that there is space now for doing development in richer countries that doesn't necessarily focus on the use of ODA. It's sort of like divorcing development and aid to some extent, and thinking very carefully about what are the good things that we can do in middle-income countries that don't require much aid. That should really be our modus operandi. And especially if the cuts go through, then that scarce sort of precious resource of grant ODA, it should be focused sort of quite ruthlessly on the poorest countries.
Great. Thanks, Rana. We will move on in just 1 second to the second topic of the Fcdo merger and what this all means for the future of UK. But Steph, there's a question coming for you just as you disappear. If you are still there, the question is on how international NGOs can actually bring down, how can they get their work done amidst budget cuts? Steph, did you get that question for you from the floor? Sweet.
I didn't. Could you say it again? Because I had to. I was refreshing my browser as instructed. So I understand you can't hear me. So
hopefully that worked for the audience as well. So the question is, how can international NGOs bring down their budgets to cope with budget cuts and still get their work done, as you seem to just suggest?
Well, that's a really sort of interesting question. I mean, I think obviously necessity is the mother of innovation. I'm sure that is what the government would suggest that we should do, is we should just do more with less. But we all know that actually doing more with less is not possible. We will be doing less with less. And I think there are important transitions that the sector and international development overall need to be making, and there's lots of things that we need to be thinking about differently, not least working much more directly with local partners, pushing for much more locally led solutions, and making that transition. But that sort of investment in transition is investment in that transition and making that effective and making sure that things don't get lost along the way is really important. So I think there are places where we can innovate, but there's also always much more to be done. I think I'm answering I hope I answered the question.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so hopefully there's a couple of tech issues that should have been improved by your refresh there, Steph, so I appreciate it for that. Let's move on to the second part of our discussion, which is around the merger. It picks up on some of the things that we've had already. So the move was announced in June 2020, well in advance of the expected arrival of the Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Foreign Policy and International Development for the autumn. And this catalysed a pretty important debate around what this meant, what type of structure should we be aiming for. We've had other models, Canada, Netherlands, Australia, where you can, or back to the old UK model, the previous Conservative governments, and what that would mean for the relative priority and direction of the So Rano, I wonder if you could update us on where you think we are now. What does the current model of the merger look like? Are we moving towards an Australian model? Is that something to be welcomed, and what should we be thinking and asking questions about, so in order to make sure that the best architecture for international aid?
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is that we just don't really know where we are yet. So much has happened since the merger was announced, and that I don't think it's at all clear whether what shape the sort of merged Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office is really going to look like, and whether it is the takeover of DFID by the FCO, or whether it is genuinely a new department, which has been the stated ambition. I don't think we can really say so far. I think when finally we find out exactly how the cuts have been undertaken, we will have a much better idea of whether development is completely deprecated in the merger, or whether it was really, I think we used the phrase, whether it was a grab of treasure by the Foreign Office, or whether it's a genuine merger. What I would say is that as development advocates, what we really want to be pushing for are three things. We want to see first a proper strategy, a clear statement of what the Fcdo is trying to achieve in different parts of the world, with its different tools, with all of the capabilities that it's got in place. There is the possibility, and I should be very clear, you did not need to merge DFID and the Fcdo to achieve this, but there is the possibility of doing more with this sort of new machinery, doing more with diplomatic pressure, doing more with non-aid tools, of pressuring across Whitehall to develop new tools like, say, a UK International Green Investment Bank, for example. So that is possible, but we need to see some sort of strategic statement of what Fcdo is going to try and achieve and where. The second thing we really want to see is that translated into a model that actually, a model of delivery across the Fcdo. We want to see whether they actually have, say, a country presence that is really differentiated, that is set up to achieve good things, basically, in very, very poor countries where you need a large amount of grant financing and a heavy presence of development professionals, way to much richer countries that may have still developing development problems or an influence on their neighboring developing countries in their region, but would require a completely different kind of country presence and portfolio. So we want to see that strategy basically translated into a model. And the last thing is sort of the tactical approach of how it's going to achieve change. And I want to sort of just link back to something that Melissa took issue with earlier. So I don't replicate the importance of research in development. Absolutely not. And I think one of the absolutely brilliant things about DFID, especially in the time where I was working there, was how seriously we took funding good research into how you actually achieve change efficiently and effectively in developing countries. That has to be the bedrock and the backbone of the decision-making structure in the new Fcdo, how it makes decisions and how it chooses between different options and different ways of operating and different ways of achieving its objectives.
Yeah.
Having said that, that does require that we focus that research on the questions that really matter for the poorest countries that are most central for development. But those are the three areas that I think that we should be advocating for right now.
Okay, thanks, Ranald. Preet, what's your sense of the merger and what's really happening? It has been referred to in the press as much more a takeover than a merger. But we don't see, and what is the hope is that it will make it very difficult for down the line for, say, a Labour government to put back in place an independent, freestanding department for international development or whatever you would call it. Is that your sense of what's happening within these changes, and what would you and Labour want to see happening?
Well, I think, I've referred to the merger as a takeover and have been, and I've seen many people refer to it as institutional vandalism, because how on earth do you get rid of a department which is independent, which has cross-party support, which is world leading, which is the reason this, brand of global Britain, of doing good in the world, is because of institutions like DFID. And I agree with Ranil that, we did not need the government in terms of its priorities, in terms of wanting, actually the government doesn't even know what global Britain stands for at the moment. It could have done that without actually having taken over this department, because diplomacy and development are two very different skill sets, and they require two very different things. And if we look at the geopolitical situation, it requires, that skill set, that focus, that leadership on the global stage, that when you suddenly merge development, and of course you have one Secretary of State, because you don't have a you don't have like a Chief Secretary as you do in the Treasury, for example, that has responsibility for development. I think Wab has been really, I've asked this question many occasions, but he's pushed back because he wants to have sole responsibility. He will decide actually what it is that they're doing. But of course, the Institute for Government said that when you do a Whitehall restructure, it costs about £50 million. I mean, how do you justify spending that much money when we're in the midst of a global pandemic and you are cutting vital, life-saving programs, really? And so, the government isn't focused on the pandemic. It's actually focused internally with its own kind of political ambitions. And Johnson, we know, has had a view about development. And so in many respects, it's no surprise, but it's very, very damaging. Is what I would say, and it's been a political choice. As Ranil said, the government doesn't have a strategy. How on earth do you do a Whitehall restructure? How do you move staff around? Because staff are leaving as well, by the way, and no doubt around the world, staff will be poached by so many different organisations and countries because of the excellence and experience and the skill set that they have, that this government has really devalued, and the kind of research that they had access to. And I think we will come on to that. I think I think these are really, really concerning times for us because, we can't hold the government to account because actually it doesn't know where its strategy, where its priority, what it's going to be doing in various countries is. And as Ranil said, you had in-country offices. You could have allowed them to build relationships with host governments. You could get them to scale up projects. But of course, the bureaucratization that we saw of DFID in the last 5 to 10 years has really been to prevent them from building these alliances. And this idea that somehow embassies and ambassadors are going to be able to think about our soft power and, building trade links and, all these other things. And somehow, who has responsibility for development being delivered in that country? How much is going to be delivered? I think ambassadors are going to be in a very difficult position about talking about things like human rights, because there's going to have to be a lot of negotiation in those roles about how you hold countries to account. What are the things that you want to work with countries? Climate is a big issue. We need to be able to take countries like India and China and many other, places with us. But, we also recognize the impact that they are having on climate change and issues within their own countries. So I think to ensure that development priorities are not submerged with other priorities and to limit that real potential for a return to that Pergo Dam style type, which is really what the concern is, because I think the government is really now thinking through ahead of the integrated review that actually it took the decision about the takeover way too quickly. It should have actually taken its time and made it really part of the integrated review, made it meaningful, really consulted and actually understood how this is actually going to work. And this idea that Rob thinks that the ambassadors are going to be able to deliver and they've got the skill sets and they know how to manage development staff, is going to be easy. I don't think it really is going to be. Frankly, that easy.
Just to follow on from what you've been saying, there's a couple of questions. So another one from Simon Maxwell. I mean, will around the integrated review, is that enough, or do we need a new white paper? I kind of hesitate because I'm not sure what we would find in such a thing from this particular government. So that's one question. Do we need a new white paper now to guide the reorientation of aid? And then secondly, are we being a bit too negative about the merger? This is a question from Julian Klein at the University of Greenwich, that maybe there'll be benefits to the aid programme from tighter links to diplomatic intelligence and maybe more solid longer-term partnerships aligned with UK trade and political interests. So what might be gained is one question from this, and also a question about the white paper. So Preet first, then come on to Melissa.
Yeah, so I think Simon's got a really good point, because we had expected quite a lot of things to be included in the integrated view. And of course, taking decisions about defence, capital spend on defence, cutting the aid budget, the merger. I don't know what else is left in the integrated review. So we shall all wait to see what it actually includes. But he's absolutely right. I mean, I think we may need to look at something else. I don't know whether it's the white paper or whether it could be something else. But I think, Britain's place in the world, especially with the new Biden administration, is going to be a very interesting one. I think we've got a real opportunity ahead of COP26, ahead of the G7, the G10, to be really showing what that kind of leadership could look like. But so yeah, I think there is some work to be done. And on the second point, look, we all want to give the government the benefit of the doubt. I want to see this work as much as anyone else, because fundamentally, what is this about? This is about helping the world's poorest, and none of us should retreat from our, commitment to them. But of course, what we're seeing now, the takeovers, what took place in June, was it, when it was announced? We are now in January. We have seen the deaths globally. We've seen the impacts on the secondary impacts, and now the COVAX facility has got the challenges about how do we manufacture and distribute a vaccine so that it's equitably available to the world's most poorest. These are real significant challenges. But the thing is, the reality is, and the facts are this, that the government doesn't have any idea as to how it's working, where it's going to prioritise, how the department's going to work. So it doesn't give anybody any confidence, actually, because by now they should at least have some indication, given what's going on around the world, and people are dying from secondary impacts. 3 billion people still don't have access to water facilities in their homes. How are they going to help themselves in this pandemic? And actually, how do we look at future preparedness for pandemics? Because this is going to be a real challenge, and we need to start thinking through some of these things. I am not encouraged at the moment of what I have seen from this government to date. And like I said, let's see, none of us wants to see, trade and aid deals like we have done before. But at the moment, none of us feel confidence from this government. We know that they will do whatever it is that they want to. They don't really care. They don't care about scrutiny and accountability. And we've pretty much seen that in terms of how they've dealt with COVID in this country as well.
That's pretty. So, Melissa, is there anything worth taking away from this merger that can help improve?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to add 2 points. One is about expertise and one is about transparency. So I fully agree that development and diplomacy and that third D, defence, have the potential to be complementary pillars. And I think we would all like to see a more joined up approach. But there are real risks with what we're seeing at the moment, that this is not a joined up, complementary and sometimes deliberated set of discussions, but it is a takeover. Totally agree that we need to see a strategy, whether it's in the form of a white paper or something else. But I'm also a bit worried by some of the signals we've got so far. So if you look at the Directors General of the new Fcdo, only 2 out of, I think, 8 have a development background. The rest are all from a Foreign Office background. Only 2 of them are women, which is another issue. But also, I don't think that we're seeing the culture of expertise, which was so much a part of DFID, hard fought for and won over many years through consistent parliamentary reviews and scrutiny, arguments that DFID needed to become more of a learning organisation, schemes like Knowledge for Development and others to make sure that DFID was being informed by the best evidence, and also recruiting people who came through as staff members, whether locally or internationally, who really had a grounding in development and development studies. And I see a real risk of that being lost. There's a very different culture in the Foreign Office, which is about much more short-term decision making. It's not a culture of science and long-term research and evidence. And I think that is a real potential loss. The other is transparency. So if you look at the relative achievements in terms of transparent governance and decision making and procurement of the UK government, which is not great, let's face it, and COVID has shown us some of the really big problems. DFID always came out absolutely top in terms of transparency, and the Foreign Office actually much less so. So now we've got a merged entity. Where is going to be our commitment to transparency in the delivery of aid to the poorest and to accountability? That's crucial. I'm really pleased to see that ICAI, the Commission for Aid Impact, as a proper aid watchdog, is being maintained, although I gather there are questions and worries about how independent they can really be. But this is absolutely one to watch, and where I think there could be real dangers ahead.
Thanks very much, Melissa. James, if you could pop Steph back on, I'd quite like her views on this as well before we turn to research. There's a question here from Joe Davis at University of Reading, meanwhile, around a key lesson was the revolving door between corporations and political power when allocating aid. Could we have the panel's thoughts on this around the revolving door between corporations and political power? And it relates to an earlier question that was posed around the longer-term privatisation and financialisation of bilateral aid in terms of private sector corporations. Any thoughts on that particular relationship between corporations and UK aid, or other thoughts, Steph, on the merger and where it's taking us?
Right. So I think that, yes, there has been a lot of subcontracting to large corporates of the aid budget, partly because DFID wasn't able to invest in its own staff, so had to sort of subcontract a lot of that out, which has not been all to the good. But I think the sort of the core thing is that the merger was all about policy coherence. I have heard the word policy coherence more in the last 6 months than in my entire life before that. And that is actually a massive opportunity, because sort of coming back to your earlier question about how could we do more with less, taking a more systemic approach where you're looking at making sure that the right hand is not slapping the left hand around the face. Sorry, that metaphor doesn't quite work, but is not contradicting what is needed, is really good. And so for something like climate change, being able to have coherence around diplomatic efforts and the need for adaptation and better conversations around loss and damage, and all of that coming together could be a real opportunity. But it's just not yet translating. And you see something like, and trade being outside that is also a problem, because you see something like the trade deal with Turkey with no reference to human rights when we were in a position to have some leverage. It doesn't seem to be coming together. So that lack of strategy and that lack of taking a systems view where you could be starting to have conversations about, well, perhaps we shouldn't be funding quite so much, so many arms to Saudi Arabia, given the situation in Yemen. You can start to have more coherent conversations. That is the opportunity. We have to see much more strategic endeavour for that to be realised.
Thanks, Steph. I wonder, just a final point on the merger and really what it would look like in the future. I noticed that even before we had the Parliamentary Committee confirmed, the International Development Committee confirmed that it would stay, you kept your title as the Shadow Secretary for International Development. Should we be thinking still in those terms when we think of the architecture for UK and international cooperation? International development and aid transfers are a sort of decreasingly important part of world financial flows. It doesn't necessarily talk to broader agendas that are genuinely global in scale, this idea of country-to-country support and so on. What would a better architecture look like down the line? Would you potentially be the Secretary of State for something else, not international development? If we took this moment to rethink strategically how to frame up the UK's activities across a range of issues, not all of which can be easily captured under the ID heading.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and it's one I get asked a lot. And what I would say, though, I think Keir's decision to retain my post and the team just absolutely shows unequivocally our commitment to development and how important it is. We also understood that, the government hadn't really thought this through, and we want to absolutely be able to scrutinise and be a strong voice for the world's poorest, but for the development sector more broadly, and thinking about how do we build solidarity? How do we have a campaign around global health strategy? How do we think about future pandemic? And I think you're right. I think the challenges in the next sort of 10 years around climate, about future pandemic preparedness, around universal healthcare, public sector investment, tackling inequality, all these things will require a department that reflects pretty much all of those challenges. And so it could be a global development. I don't know what it would be named, but I think, yes, there is a case for, what's looking ahead, the challenges ahead of us. We've got to make sure that the department encompasses all of those sort of things. One of the things that I'm really keen to do is work cross-government, departments. And so one of the things that Keir has done, he's set up a climate subcommittee, which involves all 11 shadow secretaries of state, because it's so important ahead of COP26 that it isn't just one department that has responsibility, that there is policy coherence across government departments. And we are really committed to making sure that we all kind of work together and contribute to that overall agenda. So let's watch this space. Let's see what the government does. I think, just picking up on what previously was said, I think there's been two really good wins for us, really, and that was retaining of ICAI, although, we do hear that the government wants to sort of shape what they can and can't do, and I don't think that's right, because it needs to be maintained as independent, but also retaining the International Development Committee. That has been so important, because actually it has a role to play around that accountability piece that was mentioned, because of course that becomes much more difficult when you've had take over, and you only have 2 directors with the skill sets of development. I mean, that's really hard. People are, even inside the department, are going to have to be finding a voice for development. So it is on us really to help them with that, and sort of, so let's watch this space. But I'm sure that Labour will be really committed to some form of a department that focuses on development.
That's good to hear.
Thanks, Preet. Okay, let's move on to our third and final topic. We'll try and wrap this up in about 15 minutes to leave time if anyone's got any last closing thoughts to finish off with. But it's an obvious topic for the DSA to be foregrounding, what this all means for development research. Not purely from an instrumental point of view, it's obviously key to evidence-based policy and practice, and perhaps also global Britain, given the comparative advantage of UK universities and other research elements. So DFID had a fairly strong commitment. Melissa may argue about the volume, but there was a kind of a ring fencing of 3% or so of the budget for development research. And maybe the initial signs are actually quite positive. RAB's 7 global challenges included science, research and technology, the chief economist, the chief scientific officer at Fcdo are both, as was from DFID, which is unusual, as you said, given the general tilt towards the Foreign Office priorities rather than development. They're most exceptional people. So, Melissa, what's your sense of the current direction of travel on this, and what should the priorities be in terms of really the modalities and the scale of the UK investments in development research?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think there are some positives and also some worries. So as you've said, the UK actually has been the envy of the world for its investment in development research. And this has been a key part of the Global Britain offer. It's also been a key part of the science budget. And there's always been a little bit of an overlap. It's a bit like a sort of Venn diagram, that commitment to science, commitment to development. And in the middle, there's that development research, which has in the last few years been controlled by a number of different government departments. So there's been the Research and Evidence Division in DFID, and then the research in BASE through UKRI to the Global Challenges Research Fund and the Newton Fund and others, and then a certain amount in the Department of Health and elsewhere. And I think there's also been a very positive story about ensuring coherence amongst those. And for the last 4 or 5 years, we've had the Strategic Coherence for ODA Research Board operating to give scrutiny of that coherence. And the UK Collaborative for Development Research has done a fantastic job in keeping track of mapping the gaps and highlighting a lot of process elements about really good research, best practices in partnerships, in ethics, in safeguarding. So all of that is good. Now, I think what we're seeing at the moment is some positives, as you say. So it's very good that RAB's priorities included science and research. And I think there is a commitment, certainly, amongst the Chief Science Advisor, maintaining that strength within the Fcdo. But I think budgets are really unclear. It's not at all clear what the cuts, if they happen, will do to the Fcdo's research budget. And I think there are possible scenarios that could cut it by 1/3 or up to 2/3. And if it's 2/3, that'll be cuts in some really, really swinging cuts in programmes. And at the moment, those in other government departments like UKRI have no idea what their budgets are going to be for the next year. That uncertainty in itself creates a major hiatus, I think. What we have learned, I think, over the last few years is that research and evidence are vital for good development, and they're vital for value for money, actually. I mean, in as much as that's a government priority. And there are at least 3 ways in which that's so. One is about research identifying what the problems are, what the key challenges are, to make sure that they're properly focused and prioritised. What is good change, if that's development, for who and where? The second is about evidence informing actual policies and practices and programmes on the ground, including identifying really important innovations from multiple people and places to make development really happen. And then I think the third area is research into the process of development, how aid works, what works and why, how processes can be adapted to suit local realities, the learning that goes along with programmes. And there's been enormous success in all of those things. And I think as the UK CDR set of 11 impact case studies that were launched in September showed, science and research have been critical in all of these areas. Huge contributions to improving the lives of people globally, whether one's talking about, and these are just some of the examples there, building the case for climate action, reducing the threat of malaria, understanding the multidimensional nature of poverty, tackling gender injustices, and more. And of course, we're seeing it now around COVID-19, where that research crucially is not just about technical issues, it's not just health, although the UK's health and vaccine research is at the forefront globally, but it's also about the social science intelligence that is helping us understand things like the secondary impacts and what they mean for poverty, the governance dimensions of a COVID response, and indeed issues like information exchanges and how to manage those well. So I think what we've also learned from these impacts is some key principles and approaches that are critical to the UK offer and need to remain so. It's about work that's research that's interdisciplinary. It's not just the technical, it's not just the health sciences or the crop sciences, good that the UK is at those, but it's also the kinds of things that other disciplines in development studies offer. It's what economics and anthropology and geography and sociology bring hand in hand with those technical disciplines. It's often what's sometimes called transdisciplinary, co-developed with policymakers, with businesses, with people. It's not about doing research and then kind of handing it over. It's actually about building research and evidence often into the process of development itself. It's about partnership and making sure those are equitable. It's about making sure that evidence is mobilized for action, often in real time. And again, COVID has shown us important opportunities for doing that. The Fcdo, in very foresighted way, has just funded the COVID Collective, which has now got at least 5 projects doing real-time, short-term, impact-oriented research to strengthen the response. And then it's about mutual learning. To strengthen our response to global challenges. And I think here there is also an opportunity, and this goes back to the middle income point that we were raising earlier, which is that, and it's possibly a response of a merger, that we've been thinking often about development as only applying to countries in the global south and developing countries. I think what the global interconnections are showing us is that actually there's an awful lot that the UK and middle income countries can learn from the poorest countries, as well as vice versa. So I think the vision of future development research is probably going to be a combination of ODA-funded research, which is working with and contributing to ODA programs, but also perhaps some research funding which is coming from other parts of the science budget, which is fundamentally international and could support this mutual learning and trilateral cooperation, which really once and for all reminds us that development is positive change, sustainability, tackling equity for everybody everywhere, and begins to break down some of those silos that I think many of us in the development studies community have been quite uncomfortable with over the years between developed and developing. So I think those are some opportunities as well as challenges. But I think in the meantime, it's incumbent actually on all of us, and I'm now speaking to researchers as well as other development actors, to make the case for why research is important and why actually it's an integral part of good development.
Fantastic, thanks, Melissa. Incredibly eloquent defence there. So luckily this is recorded, so we'll be able to get this out to a wider range of people, so they'll have their talking notes ready when it comes to making that defence. There's a question in the chat about whether or not research funding should be untied along with the rest of ODA. So going back to earlier development acts and so on. A query here as to whether or not GCRF funding has been untied or not. Ryan, any perspective on that before I come to you, Steph, as NGOs, both as users and producers of development research?
Yeah, I mean, just to preface it with, I agree with literally everything that Melissa just said. But if we're having a cut of £4 billion, research will be cut, like everything else. And again, it is a question of how do we make sure those cuts get focused on the it's not a nice phrase to use, but the lowest value bits of the portfolio. And that's it's a nice tie into the question about GCRF. GCRF is basically tied aid. and it is a huge program. I think it's like, what, 1 billion, 2 billion pounds over a number of years. And again, it got like an amber red or a red rating from ICAI. It is not one of the sort of high performing star jewels in the UK's research portfolio. And I would be quite happy to see that cut if it means protecting some of the more effective parts of the portfolio. And I think one of the positive things that we have, and building on what Melissa and what you said, Sam, as well, is there are a lot of great champions for good, high quality research in the Fcdo. There's Rachel, the chief economist, Charlotte Watts is the chief scientific advisor, the funder, concert director, advising Dominic Wab. These are all people who really, really deeply understand and have produced high value research that has helped improve how we do development. And the process of generating that research is not the domain of any country. And there is absolutely no reason why any research funding should be tied specifically to the UK. We do not have any kind of special knowledge about the process of development. And in fact, it's probably one of the weakest things about international development research is the sort of prominence and the sort of voice accorded to researchers from the kind of countries that we're studying and that we're working in. And, far too much research is led by and run by people from the global north, and without very much participation from local researchers, or not being led by local researchers who will have very different insights as to what the most important questions are, what the most sort of plausible methods for getting at the answer to those questions are, and so on. So yes, absolutely. All ODA for research should be, it should be untied, and we should be, not just that, we should be actively encouraging greater input from researchers in the global south.
Melissa, can you come back on those issues?
Yeah, I will come back on that. So obviously the GCRF is a very diverse beast, and it has been important in boosting the UK research community and many universities who've invested massively and been able to develop their capabilities for development research on the back of this enormous amount of funding. I think to say it's tied is a bit restrictive, because what it's also done is to enable a lot of partnerships and to support capacity building and to support, as the GCRF has moved on, there's been insistence on having co-investigators from low middle income countries and on having genuine partnerships, and indeed under some programs led by some of the research councils to allow leadership and PIs from those countries. I would be absolutely behind and have argued for, as it were, a full untying, which lets anybody lead a GCRF program. But in the meantime, I think it's a unfair accusation to tar all of GCRF with the same brush. I think it's actually helped to build some capabilities amongst researchers in low middle income countries, which will now enable them to step forward and lead some of these programs, which is absolutely what should happen into the future.
Thanks. Steph, what role would research, if any, play in an advocacy campaign from Bond in relation to the aid spend? Would be one issue, but there's other issues I'm sure you could comment on in relation to UK investment in development research.
I think the critical thing is the learning and the need to be agile. And so global challenges are such that we can't afford to be making the same mistakes over and over. We need to be learning, and that learning needs to be happening in a local context. So just like development, I would be advocating for research to be locally led as well. I think that's part of the whole need to decolonize aid in development. But that point, so as practitioners, learning is really critical. Research and evidence is a central part of that. I think it has played a really critical role in how strong the UK is in terms of international development. So we'd certainly be supportive of that. I think there's one of the things that is slightly off is that science, research and technology is seen as the big global challenge, when actually, in terms of the strategic priorities, when actually those things have to be in service of making progress on climate change, on girls' education, on all of those other things. So it's a tool rather than a priority, and needs to be deployed really practically so that we are making change on the ground. And I think the way that research and practice are coming together much more actively is definitely the direction of travel we want to see.
Okay. Thanks, Stephanie. And Preet, anything on Labour's agenda, as it were, in relation to development research? We hear that one of the reasons why science and technology has a high profile within this government is because of a certain erstwhile advisor within Number 10. I'm not sure if what noises your leader is hearing in his ear from his advisors and the role of science, technology, and in particular development researchers.
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to the kind of original point that Melissa made, I think we're, in the United Kingdom, I think we're just in an incredibly privileged position where we've got amazing but very passionate academics working on all facets of development specific and development adjacent work. And for me, I'm very lucky as an MP. I've got 3 universities in my constituency. I can't stress how much I really value, having conversations with people on all sorts of issues and these areas. What was really interesting, though, when I was Shadow Minister, I went to Uganda and not knowing enough about how much we committed to research at that time and how it was being utilised. One of the things that it really struck me, I think, is the point that Ranil made, is the global north being, far too often being at the forefront of some of this research. One of the things I asked many of the aid sectors is, how are you getting access to the brilliant research that DFID actually commissions? How do you get it in country? How do you get it in terms of, around, whether it's around climate issues, whether it's around energy sources, whether it's about, getting various things into settlements, because of course people are living in rural areas. How can we just be more innovative, working with higher institutions? So I think partnership is really, really key in this. I mean, we are already seeing lots of universities here build partnerships across the world, on issues that they are working on, global issues that they are trying to resolve together. India has commissioned University of Birmingham to do a piece around climate, because of course when certain crops are grown, they're having to be burnt before the next crop is, and the impact on climate over the period of years is huge, and it's really, really significant. So I want to see much more of that collaboration between the sector and research and DFID, because there's no point commissioning, there's no point just trying to commission really good piece of research and then you do nothing with it, and it sits in an office somewhere in Whitehall, or it's on a database somewhere, and it means very little to people who don't have access to a printer, working out in sort of rural parts of Uganda, trying to support Sudanese refugees, for example. So I just think we need to be much more smarter, much more joint up. We've got to really have those absolute, partnerships together. And I just think, that is basically what my vision for UK development work is, pretty much on the principle of partnerships. And I think, working together, combining the expertise, the skills and the knowledge is the only way we really overcome them. And it's the only way we're going to build a safer, better world. And so rather than treating, I think it was a point that Melissa made, finally, that rather than treating development research in silos or allowing different funding pots to create this race to the bottom, we've got to ensure development as a whole remains high up the agenda, because that's really where research flows from. And so I'm really supportive of the impact that research can have. I'm very supportive of many of our academics, leading in certain areas. And I challenge my universities with this. I say, I come to the university, I visit your departments, I get to hear the most amazing, inspiring innovation. But why are you holding on to it like it's this secret? You need to shout about it. You need to share it. You need to engage civil society. People need to know what are the solutions to the challenges that we face that you are putting forward. And then the onus is really on ministers and civil servants and Whitehall to make sure that that is cascaded, that they are able to link up, higher education institutions, build those partnerships and really see them grow and sustain, because I think that is where you get real meaningful impact from the work that you all are doing so brilliantly. So thank you for everything that you do. Honestly, it's been Amazing. It's been wonderful to see how many people have joined the call. I mean, and have the interest. For me, that's really, really heartening that so many people really care about development.
Thanks, Preet. And you've actually got to there just ahead of me. My last, I was going to ask all panelists if they had one advice or entreaty for the development studies community in the UK that we should take away from this discussion, from the priorities you're setting yourselves in your own work. What would it be? Presumably yours would be the last point there, that we should be much more skillful and committed at getting our work out. Perhaps maybe not just as policy actors, but also to the broader public would be one reading of your comments there. So do come back if you go ahead. Anything further, then I'll come to the other panelists.
The other thing I will say is on SDGs, I think it's so important that we recognise our role within Sustainable Development Goals, because of course we have to do the VNR as well. And it's been wonderful to get Birmingham City as the first city in the country to adopt the motions of the SDGs and think about how it plans, how it engages civil society. I think universities have got to a place, I think your departments have got a place to really shout out about this in your institutions, to get young people involved, to tell them what it means, to have these global goals and how these indicators can actually be used as a blueprint for so many different things. The very fact that civil society here in the UK still does not know enough about SDGs just tells us how far we are in terms of meeting the challenges ahead of us of 2030. And of course, this pandemic has really put us back. So I just think the engagement that your institutions do, how do they collaborate with our schools? What is the wider offer around some of the work that you are doing, getting young people engaged very early on by some of these issues? We do see that when people get to university, they might have been interested in development much earlier. That kind of wanes off in a way, and of course they've got huge other priorities around studies, etc. But we want them still to play a part, have a voice, and feel enthused and encouraged to be part of the wider global, family sector, really.
Great point, Preet. And Ranil, what's your challenge for the development studies community?
I'd say three things. First one is put your data out in public. Publish it, publish your code if you're a quantitative researcher, always. Second thing is open publishing. Don't hide all your research behind your paywalls. Most government departments do not have subscriptions to JSTOR. They are not reading your papers because of that. Or if they are, they're reading old working paper versions. And the third thing is spend a lot more time talking about where your research sits in a broader set of knowledge and what it helps us understand about how to change the world, and a lot less time focusing on the data paper that you've written and giving us a single presentation which isolates, which sort of focuses on one set of findings in isolation of all this broader knowledge that you're standing on.
Excellent, all very good stuff. And Steph?
I guess I would say make it as real and practical as possible, and so that it can be directed at change. I'd say make sure that you are looking at part of the system, as Ranil has said, actually looking at how everything works in context, and helps us get to the root causes of the problems, and making sure that solutions really work is critical. And the final thing is really about that partnership point, that work collectively across disciplines, across countries, with the people that we are there to work with, show solidarity in that going forward.
Thanks, Steph. And Melissa?
I think for me, it would be captured actually by the two words engaged and excellent, which actually were part of our last IDS strategy. And I won't belabor that, but it's firstly to recognise that research has to be really good. It has to be rigorous. It has to be robust, whatever methods it uses. Otherwise, I mean, we owe that as a duty. Shoddy research is worse than useless, actually. It can be really damaging. But it also has to be engaged, which means it has to be developed with in collaboration with the people to whom it matters and the people who have the capacity to take action, be they civil society, businesses, citizens, communities, international policymakers. And it has to be presented in a form in which it can be mobilized to make a difference. And that does mean collaboration and partnerships. And finally, I think we shouldn't forget the politics of knowledge and research. We've been talking a lot, if slightly implicitly in this webinar, about politics and the politics that have underlain some of the cuts and moves that we're happy or less happy about in recent times. Similarly, we mustn't forget that there's also a politics to knowledge and research. And yes, there is truth. Yes, there is evidence. Yes, there is robust research. But what questions one asks, what evidence is selected, who uses it and takes it up is also a political matter. And I think as researchers, we do well to remember that and to be astute about it and to be responsible about the ways that our research can be used for good or sometimes for less good, and responsible and accountable to those we ultimately would like it to make a difference to.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. We're bang on time to finish, so I'd just like to say a huge thank you for our panel, not just for their time, but really compelling insights that they've delivered to us, and some really good guidance for the sector and for us as individuals within that. My request would be that you stay engaged with the DSA. I forgot to mention I'm currently president, so I've got a vested interest in that. If you're not a member, get in touch. We can soon sort that. And we will be holding future webinars down the line where we hope to play a stronger role, I think, in public debate around not just aid, but other development issues as well. So Ranil, Preet, Melissa, Steph, many thanks, and see all of you hopefully at a later event before too long, and do take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.